want Alyssa's title.
Director of Information Policy.
Yeah, that's the title I like.
I like how they call their department information development. I was talking to my boss about that. We're in information assets. I like information development way more.
Well, we're technical communication, but I like information development better.
Yeah. Makes you think of developers, like coders, more understanding what
Yep.
they do.
How does one here? This is never going to go out of business. Because the ones with Straight Hill and Burlington don't. The ones on Burlington and Straight Hill.
Yep.
Laura's on her way.
Oh,
She
good.
had to go home.
Oh, is your boss working you to death? Is that why you're late?
Yes, that's right.
That's me.
I love her too.
Grab something to eat. We'll start in a few minutes. No, we've been just eating birthday cake. Oh my
That's
God.
what my birthday was.
We have so many birthdays in the week, and next week, my boss is next week, and one of the CAs that we work with is next week. She's like 6 days after me, and people, yeah, I mean, yeah, all day, like last 3 since Sunday. So that's, let's see, 9 months from now is about New Year's, Christmas time. From now?
No,
That-
it's more like Advent or something. Not quite sure. They have a movie theater. I know they have a farm.
It was a cold winter month.
Yeah. Everybody likes to snuggle by there.
Before there was the internet.
Yeah, television just wasn't even out yet. That's pretty scary.
But there's one on Fremont.
Didn't television come out? When did it come out? I know I had a TV when I was a kid, so. But it was black and white.
And you just have DVR to watch what you wanted when you wanted.
Hey, we didn't even have color TV.
I want to hear about me too.
We had black and white TVs. I watched the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show when I was 9 years old.
You remember the vacuum tube?
The what?
Vacuum tube?
Never can tell we're
Yeah. Oh my God, yeah. Wow. My mom,
We're on TV, it takes 2 or 3 minutes to warm up for a come on.
my new one does that too. Flat screen, I don't know why.
Oh, the Agile, they didn't have to start up.
We had,
We're gonna end up.
I just remember my mom telling me all the time that I could care less about the TV shows and I just run to the commercial.
Well, the commercials used to be more interesting. What do you have, 19? Oh, we're in Agile.
No, it's not.
What?
Spicy meatballs, you didn't like those?
Remember we had that before?
Where's the beef?
We actually delivered. We actually delivered our pleasure.
Do you remember where's the beef?
Yeah,
Barrel color.
Yeah, we couldn't until the system all went live.
Laura went all the way home? Are you kidding? She's coming back.
This save me some food.
She went all the way home to Oviedo.
Wow, that's
Far.
I know.
That's about 45 minutes, right?
yeah.
Probably more.
And then traffic, traffic, that way. Yeah.
Well, she may come in like that. How are we doing? Is it time you want to run home? Couple more minutes. We'll leave.
We'll hear in 5.
5 minutes?
Awesome.
That's a while ago.
That about 5 minutes ago, so.
She'll be back.
Yes, that's right.
We were lucky I came in early because this was the room wasn't set up.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, we just set it up.
Tell me your name, I'll take it. What's your face? Nobody looks at me.
We get to see on pretty good faces.
So we're either both in bad shape or both in good shape.
I don't know if it's better with names or faces, everybody I know.
No, it's called your favorite name. I've noticed you.
She made it. That was fast. I know. Get you some food, get you some food. Did you check in with you?
That's my cake.
Okay.
That's my chocolate.
Yeah, it's gonna be definitely chocolate.
All right, I had my pleasure.
We have a volume here so we can all hear. Okay. Where'd she go? I just have a couple announcements before we get started and see if anyone else has any. Well, I'll go ahead and go ahead. She's already something. Welcome everybody, and we're glad that you're here tonight for our STC chapter meeting and workshop, as we call it here, for our company. Tonight we have a very special guest on the phone that's going to be doing a great program for us, and I'll wait for, I'm going to let Sarah introduce her for you, but I just have a couple announcements. My name's Deborah Johnson. Hi, Mary. I'm the chapter president, and I have a few announcements to make just before we get started so we can get going with our program. I know it was kind of a short notice this week, but this month and next month and maybe even the following month, we're going to be a collection site for a gift for teaching. So next meeting, if you have supplies or school supplies and stuff, we'll collect it, and then it's really close to here, so I'll drop it off. So if anybody wants to bring anything to the meeting, we would appreciate it. As Sarah said in her announcement, it's new or gently used school supplies in good condition, traditional school like office supplies, books, and any other learning materials that you may have. If you want to bring it in, we'll take care of it and drop it off for that. I got an email this week, actually on Tuesday, and just wanted to let everybody know from the STC New England chapter. They're having a competition, their technical communications competition for their regional chapter, and I'm going to go ahead and just read this really quick. It's been over 2 years since they had hosted a local competition. So they wanted to touch base with us and see if there was any interest in any of our members to submit entries into their competition. We would love to receive them. So, from any sister chapter unable to sponsor their own regional competition. So if you were interested in doing and finding out more about it, just email me and I'll send you the email and the link to where you can find out more information about it. So we got, and that's the New England Chapter Council Member Online Competition Committee Chair is Kurt Krober. So I'll let anybody who's interested in submitting an entry, just let me know and I'll give you the information. And then we also wanted to make sure that everyone knows about the Suncoast chapter over in Tampa is having an event on October 19th, Saturday at 9:30. There's coffee. They're having coffee and pastries, and then a presentation and a complimentary lunch for a social media seminar on branding, networking, and user assistance. And I believe that's Paul Mueller that's going to be the president of UserAid, and an STC fellow is going to be there and hosting. So I'm really excited. I'll sit back up. I think I'm going to join that because he's really great at presenting. And then also, it's at the Spring Hill Suites Marriott on Ulmerton Road in Clearwater. So if you want more information about that, they had sent out, I think WC had sent out an announcement, but if you need more information, just email me as well. Does anyone else have any other announcements? Ma'am?
Stay up here. This is the announcement I sent to you. Yeah, okay. So this is, our chapter is a member of the CCTS, Cape Canaveral Technical Societies, which is an umbrella organization in Brevard County for all kinds of companies that deal with technical contractors, tech writers, engineers, NASA probably, who knows. Anyway, so we are one of their member organizations. It's an organization of organizations, and we are a new member of that organization. They hold science fairs. They have lists of their member society meetings, so we can post our meetings in their promotional materials. And we receive their promotional materials of some of the things that they're doing. They seem to have some kind of tie to FIT, and I'm not sure if it's just that that's one of their own. I think what it is that some of their boards actually are working there or on the faculty there. Anyway, so the Florida 2013 Tech Expo is Florida's premier technology and innovation exposition. They sent out a flyer. Come ask me about it if you want. It's Tuesday, October 8th, from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. It's being hosted by FIT in Melbourne. So these are all going to be Brevard County things, which is not bad. So it's some kind of a tech expo. And then there's a group called Tech Innovation Awards Dinner Kickoff. That's October 7th on Monday from 5:30 to 9. What I'm going to do when I get these notices, which I get them once a month, is I'll just start posting them to the listserv. But since I haven't done that yet, I'll do these tonight when I get home. But since I haven't done that yet, I just wanted to introduce the idea. We belong to this organization. We are a due-paying member, an organizational member of this organization of technical society. And we should support them because they are going to have interesting programs that we can attend as members of the member society.
Oh, cool. Sarah, would you like to introduce our presenter this evening?
Yes, I would. Alyssa Fox is speaking to us from Texas. She is the current secretary of the International Society, and she's also the director of information development, as you can see there. Alyssa has a lot of experience working with Scrum and Agile. In fact, if you ask someone about any information about what Agile is and how it works with TechCom, most people will refer you to her white paper. So I'm really excited that we have an expert who's knowledgeable as she is to talk to us about how Agile and how processes work with technical communication. So without further ado, Alyssa.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Good. So as Sarah said, my team has been working with Agile for about 7 years now, I guess. And I appreciate Sarah contacting me and asking me to come speak to you guys. And I also appreciate the Orlando Central Florida chapter for hosting me. I'm pretty passionate about the technical communicators' role in Agile development. And I feel like if done well, it can be a major boon to the project team as well as the information developer. If not done well, it makes things a little more difficult. So what I'd like to share tonight is some of the tips that my team has found have been useful in working on their various Scrum teams. So I don't intend to go into too many definitions about Agile methodology and Scrum and all that sort of thing. This isn't intended to be a beginning session, so I hope you know a little bit about Agile already. I do want to focus on a couple of transition points that I'll be talking about throughout the presentation, just to give you guys an intro. First of all, if you've worked in any kind of waterfall method before, you've probably used PRDs, which are product requirements documents. And typically the product owner or product manager would write these. And they're usually really long documents that talk all about what each requirement is in detail. And then typically the design team and the development team would then build products and designs from that document. So with Agile or Scrum, I'm going to talk a lot about Scrum because we use Scrum. We use backlogs. So instead of having these big monolithic documents, requirements are expressed as user stories in the backlog. And all the backlogs should be prioritized by value, cost, knowledge, and risk. And this will change as you go throughout the project, but a backlog that is not prioritized is not very useful, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. The backlog should also be estimated in relative effort terms by the team. I'll also go into more detail about that. After PRDs, typically in the waterfall method, you would use specs or specification documents. These are typically design documents that whoever the architect was of the software or a design team maybe would write out in, again, a nice big document, what the design for a particular feature would be, or a group of features called a theme in Agile. So now what you have is you capture that information in the user story as well. So the backlog is made of user stories. The user story will have all of this information about what you're expecting to see when that particular user story is complete. It's easier to rework in these smaller chunks, and if you have good acceptance criteria, then you have quite a bit more benefit, and the team is more in sync. So a little bit of what I'm going to talk about tonight is what we call here the whole team approach to quality. And Lisa Crispin is a very popular Agile tester, and she has a couple of really great books, and she talks a lot about the whole team approach. And what that is taking a high-level, across-the-board view of how to work together. So typically in waterfall, and sometimes in Agile, unfortunately, people tend to focus on their own particular area. For example, development, those that code, QE or QA, those that test, and then information development or TechCom or whatever your particular department might be called, those that write, quote unquote. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how everybody can work together as a team versus deciding or delineating between those functional areas. So typically the Scrum team is composed of the product owner, the Scrum master, and the engineering team. So in our engineering team here, we have development, QE, and ID, which I just talked about. So in the past, we actually thought we were doing Agile very well, but we weren't, and that's what I'm going to talk about here with the old way. So as I mentioned, there were often divisions among functional areas. So everybody saw things through their own lens. Developers saw it through a coding lens. Testers saw it through a testing lens. Tech writers saw it through a writing lens. QE would often see themselves as the only people that could work on quality. That was their job because quality is engineering, quality is in their name. Documentation was the sole responsibility of the ID team. Everybody knew that, okay, we have a team, InfoDev, that writes the docs, so they need to write the documentation. Often, this is the biggest indicator I see of a non-whole team approach. QE and ID are lagging behind Dev in their sprints rather than having their tasks in the same sprint with Dev. We'll talk about that a little more. And then often what you see is done and done, which is kind of a silly phrase, but often what we would run into was when development would finish the code for something, they declared it done. But we still had testing to do for that user story. We still had documentation to do. Sometimes we had validation with customers to do. And then, so once we did all that, it was considered done. So what was happening was, instead of taking that high-level whole team approach and view of that user story and considering the entire thing done, it was basically being split up into two statuses, done and done. The problem with that is when you're supposed to have potentially shippable features at the end of a sprint, and you can't have that if you only have code done. If you get to the end of the sprint and only the code is done, then you have nothing to ship. So it's better for the entire team to focus on a couple of stories and get those completely done than it is to have 7 user stories that have only the coding done, because you won't be able to ship anything. And I don't know, do you guys want me to go all the way through and take questions at the end, or allow them during the presentation? Because I just want to make sure that I do it the way you guys usually do it.
Whatever you're comfortable with, Alyssa.
Okay. I'm comfortable with questions during the presentation. If anybody has one, feel free to stop me. Otherwise, we'll just cover it at the end because this is a lot of material, so something might pop up. Okay. Okay. So the new way that we do it, or try to do it now, is that we ensure that the whole team knows exactly what we are building and what we are not building. Often people think they have something in their, they have a thought about where the direction we're going, so they're heading off down one path. The rest of the team is heading off down another path, and you get to the end of the sprint, and they're not in sync, so we have nothing shippable, or that user story is not done completely because people are going different ways. Another aspect of the new way is that the entire team accepts responsibility for completing all aspects of each user story. This is really important because often what you'll find on a Scrum team is that, as I mentioned before, when a coder is done with something, with their part, they say, okay, user story is done. The user story is not done. And it is that coder's responsibility to ensure that they are helping out QE and ID if they need to get that story done, rather than going on to the code part of another story. Another feature of this is the whole team acknowledges that the user story is not done until it's tested. All of the stop ship bugs are fixed, and it is documented. There are certain criteria for that user story to be complete, and the better defined and those are called acceptance criteria. The better defined those are, the more likely everyone will be on the same page at the end of the sprint, and the user story will be complete in a way that satisfies everyone, including the product owner, which is the ultimate person that you want to sign off on the way you implemented that story. Quality and documentation tasks occur within the same sprint as development tasks, not lagging behind. I really, really push this. If you ask anybody on my team about what's my #1 Agile rule for info dev, this is it. Your tasks must be in the same sprint as QE and dev. If they're not, first of all, it makes it look like the info dev representative is not an equal member of the team, because it looks like their stuff, can be pushed, so they're not as important as getting the dev and QE stuff done. So that's one part of it, is just the teamwork aspect. The other part of it is everything rolls downhill. So if you start letting info dev lag behind at the beginning of the project, they're going to be behind the entire project. And then Agile does us no good anyway, because we won't have anything potentially shippable at the end of the sprint if it has no doc. So your options would be either delay that user story, which is kind of silly because one of the main points of Agile is to ship faster, or you can ship with no doc, which is also not a good user experience typically. And then so now what we have, instead of done and done, we have simply not done and done. Done means all of those parts are complete. So there are various ways of ensuring that this happens, and a lot of times you're not going to be able to work in a whole team approach if you don't have at least some of these, if not all of these, going on. And part of this is an uphill battle for a long time. As I mentioned, we've been doing this 7 years. We actually sort of rebooted ourselves in 2011 and brought in a trainer to teach everybody Agile again the way we really wanted to do it. Because for the first 5 years that we did it, we were floundering all over the place, and we didn't do all this stuff that I'm talking about now. We did bits and pieces here and there. We had a couple of teams that were really good and ran like a well-oiled machine, and they did it, but we didn't do it across the board. So this is some of the stuff that we were taught in our training, our retraining, I should say, a couple of years ago. So you have to have unit testing. Everybody should be doing unit testing no matter what kind of development methodology you're doing. And what I mean by unit testing is developers, after they code something, they need to be running a test on it themselves to ensure it works. Unfortunately, I have heard developers say, I don't need to test my code, that's QE's job. It's not QE's job to make sure that you are a professional. So you need a professional developer needs to make sure that he or she does unit testing on the things that they code, because ultimately we have had builds break before on things that would have been caught in a simple unit test. And that wastes a lot of time and a lot of money when you spend half a day trying to figure out what the deal is because somebody didn't write a 5-minute unit test to ensure that their code check-in worked. A big one is automated acceptance and regression testing. Anybody that has transitioned from waterfall to Agile can probably see in waterfall, typically at the end of a software release, you can have, depending on how big the project is and how big the features are that you've put into it for that release, you can have anywhere from a month to 4 months just of regression testing, trying to ensure that everything that you just added to the project doesn't break anything, makes it maintainable and sustainable going forward, check the performance, check the scalability. If you don't have any of that automated, you're adding months, weeks, months, sometimes, you know, if you mess something up pretty bad, 6 months even, onto your release cycle. So the more that you automate and can run each sprint, every time you code a new feature and you run that automated regression within a sprint, that is less testing tacked to the end that is going to hold up your release. Including QE and info dev and estimates. This is a big one. A lot of times people think that documentation is simply, oh, we'll just go document the new features and we're good. The problem with that is over years and years of doing that, you end up with libraries that are never refactored, never reworked, never evaluated for whether they're still meeting the needs of the user. A lot of times they need to be streamlined, cut down, you know, typical rework on our part, just basically infrastructure work that tech writers do. And sometimes somebody might think it's not a big deal for somebody to code a feature, but it's a very intensive doc effort for whatever reason. Maybe you have to reorganize the whole thing, or it's going to require a lot of explanation, that sort of thing. If you do not include ID and QE in the estimates at the beginning of a project, then you're going to run into trouble because you're going to miss your date right off the bat. Test-driven development, we talked a little bit about this with some unit testing. This is, I don't know of a lot of people doing this. This is kind of difficult, but it's basically, the concept is that you write tests to just enough code to make the test work for that acceptance criteria. So it's kind of a, instead of just coding till something works, you actually write the test first and then code to that test. So it's a little more difficult to do. It's a little harder to change that mindset, but it does aid considerably in Agile. Fixing bugs within your sprints. The more that your bugs pile up from sprint to sprint and you don't fix them within that sprint, that's more technical debt that your team is accruing. And this is the big one. This is what whole team approach is. When your tasks are done for a sprint, you help somebody else. Whether it's automating test cases, doing usability testing, helping to set up virtual machines and environments for other people, writing the first drafts of doc, backlog grooming. And that means anybody on the team, whether they're historically a coder, a tester, or a writer, can do any of these items. You just find something that you can do to help. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's going to have the skills to do every one of these things. But we have found that when we actually really put effort into doing something like this, we have found ways to help other people out. Because if you do finish all your tasks and move on to something else, say a developer does that, then already QE and ID is behind on whatever that new task is that the developer is working on. Now, I did note here that resource constraints might mean you're working on multiple projects, and if you finish all of your tasks for one sprint for one project, you might need to tackle some sprints for another project. And that is the story of our life in InfoDev at NetIQ, because everybody on my team is involved with at least 2 or 3 projects just because of the way we are staffed. We do not have dedicated writers for each project. So this is what happens with us. Typically people are helping us out rather than us helping them. But the idea is that the attitude is there that you're willing to help in other areas. Okay, so just a few guidelines about the way that you manage sprints and helping this work. So you really have to make sure that you treat QE and ID as part of the whole engineering team and equal parts of that team. A lot of environments, unfortunately, in software are very dev-focused, kind of the programmers are gods kind of thing. And if that mentality is present, it's going to be very, very difficult for this approach to be used. And because of the pace of Agile, I don't think you're going to be very successful for very long if you're doing that, because as I mentioned, dev's going to get way ahead of everybody else, and then there's no point in that because you can't ship without the work from QE and ID as well. So make sure that you're developing vertical slices during sprints rather than one component per sprint. For example, if you're coding a new feature, you need to make sure that you code the back-end piece, such as the database, the middle tier, and the UI, all for that one feature. If you do all database work in one sprint and then go to the second sprint and do all middle tier work, and then the third sprint and you do all UI work, that takes you 3 sprints to have anything that you can ship. Whereas in the first sprint, if you did all 3 pieces of one feature, you could even if it's only one feature, you could ship that within one sprint. So you have to think about how do I look at this vertically versus horizontally. As I mentioned before, feature testing, regression testing, and documentation occur in the same sprint. That's really essential. If you have a testing or a doc crunch at the end of the sprint, you're doing something wrong. If this happens sprint after sprint after sprint, you got to figure out what you're doing wrong and fix it. A lot of times it's test automation. If you're only doing manual testing, that takes so long, it's going to bleed over into other sprints. Another one is coding up till the very last day of the sprint. If you're running a 4-week sprint, you need to have coding. Typically what we try to do on 4-week sprints is have the coding done by the end of the 3rd week. That gives QE and ID that last week to wrap up anything that they couldn't see before then, for example, because our testers, of course, and our writers are running their own installs and their own builds, or not their own builds, but they're installing the builds so that they can see things. And as long as they're getting those consistent nightly builds or whatever, then they can code and, they can test and write, but you still need to see that final product. You know, if there's a field on the screen that's not operable up until the last day of the sprint, well, you can't write about that. It's going to bleed over into the next sprint. And often there are cuts in the scope that have to be handled in the doc. That's usually something that's a problem, or you're not getting enough information early. Okay, so we're going to talk about 2 kinds of planning, release planning and sprint planning. Release planning involves choosing a set of user stories that have been estimated that match the product manager or product owner's requested release theme, and that we think that we can fit into a timely release. And all of this is based on the expected velocity. So velocity is when you go through several sprints, you have these things called burn down charts, and they typically show you how you estimated something and then how the actual time it took to do something. And the idea is that at the end of each sprint, you look at these burn down charts, see how things went, see how far your estimates were off or on, and adjust accordingly. So after a few sprints, you'll pretty much get an average of how much a team can do in a sprint. So you need to use that information and actually estimate the next sprint accordingly. So you don't want to pull too many too many user stories from the backlog into a release if you know that your team's velocity is such that you can't make that. So in the backlog, you need to have at least enough sprintable, high-priority user stories broken down to fill the first sprint. Ideally, what we tell people is 2 to 3 sprints worth. So your entire backlog for a product is going to be probably fairly hefty, especially if it's a mature product. The idea is that you pull in or you prioritize and flesh out the user stories up near the top of the backlog more because you're going to be pulling them into sprints sooner than you would be other user stories. And then as you groom your backlog on a regular basis, you will continue to break down those user stories, flesh them out, and do estimates. And then in early sprints during a release, that's when you need to get rid of your major dependencies on other products and high risks. The problem with leaving a high risk or a dependency on another major component or major project towards the end of a cycle is as soon as you hit a problem, you're probably going to miss your ship date. If you do it early in the cycle, you can make appropriate adjustments and cut scope a little easier to make your date. So this is just a little clip from a spreadsheet that we have used in the past to basically do milestones for a release. With Agile, it's very fluid. Typically, because you're running a business, you can't always just say you're going to ship when you feel like you have enough. I know, like for my company, we have customers that expect certain things by certain dates. And we tell them when we're coming out with certain features because that's how we make money. You know, we try to retain those customers, and the way we do that is ensuring that they know when we're doing things. So we can't just kind of ship whenever we feel like it. So it's kind of an interesting hybrid between quote-unquote pure Agile, which I think is a myth, and running a business. So you have to have some kind of milestones of when you're going to fit your pieces into the overall release. So this is just an example of some of the milestones that we've used in the past. We don't use them all for all projects, but it gives people an idea of when some info dev deliverables are going to come out. So probably one of the biggest adjustments that we've had to make in the documentation group is the way that we review documentation and have it reviewed by team members. So in the past, what we did was we had a first draft, an approval draft, and a quality edit draft. And in a waterfall method, you know, we did the first draft when it made sense, when we had enough information to kind of do that, and then we did the approval draft after feature complete, and then we did our quality edit at the very end. That was kind of just a last-minute check to make sure everything was good to go. Now what we have to do is, because we have the Agile sprints, we actually write the doc for the feature in the sprint in which it was developed and tested, as I've mentioned. And then we have the SMEs review the doc for technical accuracy as part of the user story acceptance criteria. So that user story cannot be closed until that doc is written and reviewed by a subject matter expert. Typically it's somebody in Dev or QE, it doesn't matter which, just whoever. A lot of times it's the developer that's coding that feature. But we get that doc reviewed within the sprint, and we consider that first draft. Now, sometimes if we're doing a brand new 1.0 product, we will have a first draft of the entire book that we usually run by somebody within our own team just to kind of check layout and make sure our organization makes sense and that kind of thing. We don't do hardly any of those anymore because we don't have as many 1.0 products. So typically by the time you've got an established library, we're not doing that full first draft for the book. And then what we do later is in the release cycle after feature complete, everything has already been reviewed. All the doc has been reviewed. It's just been reviewed in snippets. So what we did, as the features were developed during the sprints. So what we do is we typically send out the book, the full book, for a review so they can see, the team can see all of those snippets in context to make sure that we didn't put, you know, this feature really doesn't make sense in the chapter that you put it in, and here's why. We don't always have, in fact, we rarely have feedback like that. Typically, you know, we know our products well enough to know where it should go in the doc. But we like to give everybody just kind of that second chance to take a look and say, okay, this makes sense here. I see why you did that, or I really think this should go somewhere else. So we have a lot of benefits from this. First of all, we have gotten much better reviews since we started doing this. When you send out a 150-page book near the end of a release, most people don't want to look at it. Nobody wants to look at 150 pages of doc. Testers are usually busy testing because they haven't automated all their testing like they should, so they're doing that bit of regression at the end, even though we're Agile. And, you know, if you only send an email that's got a few paragraphs or a couple of pages of doc, they're like, oh, yeah, I have time for this. And you actually get better reviews because they really read it instead of sending back a book with 0 comments in it that says, looks good, which isn't very helpful. The documentation, because of that, is more technically accurate and a higher quality. Then they don't have to spend as much time looking at an approval draft later. If they've seen all those pieces, all they have to look at is, does this fit into this area of the book versus having to read all of those pages, as I mentioned. And if you're working on multiple projects, this is a biggie. You don't have to take up as much time dealing with multiple approval drafts for multiple projects and multiple teams and multiple reviewers. It can get pretty hairy, especially if you've got both of your projects releases going out around the same time, or both of your approval drafts going out at the same time, or if you have multiple books for one project, that when you've got 20 people sending you reviews versus doing it in each sprint, and it's much more spaced out. Okay, so creating user stories. User stories to me are the life and blood of sprints. And if you do user stories right, I think it really solidifies the team on what you're building and gets you to where you need to be with your users a lot better than if you don't look at user stories in the perspective in which they're meant to be looked at. So a user story is a software requirement written from the user's point of view. And I probably should have bolded written from the user's point of view, because this is probably the hardest thing to do when you're doing your planning in Agile. A lot of times developers, product managers, or product owners that are writing these sometimes understand the user point of view, sometimes not. This is one area where information development can really help, because we are user advocates and we are able to see things from that user point of view because we write for the users so that they will understand. A lot of times if developers are writing this, I've seen a lot of user stories that say code the database piece for the X feature. That is not from the user's point of view. The user doesn't care about the database. All they care about is how that feature works and helps them do their job. They might know there's a database piece, but they don't want to see all that ugly back-end stuff and how it works. So you need to always be thinking about, how does the user see this? It defines what's to be built, and it should be prioritized in the backlog. And as I mentioned before, it's often part of an epic or a theme, which is a group of features, or group of user stories. Now, something that we've done here on several of our teams that has really, really helped to make the user story about the user is to break down each user story into a problem statement, appropriate acceptance criteria, and then acceptance tests to actually test those criteria and ensure that they happen. So this forces people writing, the team who are typically writing the user stories together with the help of the product owner, to think about, why are we coding this? So for example, in the problem statement, you can say what behavior is functionally broken and how, or what is the user's pain point? What is the user trying to do? It has to be user-facing. And then what the team does is has the developer write the initial statement. And this is often interesting. There's a couple reasons we do this, because the developer is going to be the person coding it, so that we need to make sure they understand why they are coding something. And second of all, when they write the initial statement, then get the input from the architect, QE, and info dev, then those other people can help that developer point it more towards a user-focused thought process if the developer doesn't have it, which typically developers don't. So it's a learning process for them, but it also gets the team all on the same page, and they must all approve that problem statement before it's put in the user story. So it's a discussion. And then once you have the problem statement written, you have to determine, how will users know if this problem is fixed? Good acceptance criteria doesn't say, well, I'll give you an example in a minute. So they have to, the acceptance criteria has to show how the problem is fixed. Otherwise, it's not detailed enough. So before QE accepts that user story, it has to meet the acceptance criteria that is documented within the user story. All of this stuff is documented inside whatever tool you're using to track your user stories. Again, the developer will write the initial criteria and then get input from the product architect, QE, and ID. And again, everybody has to approve it, and then they put it in the user story. And the acceptance tests are typically written by Dev and QE. So this is actually, what test are we going to run to ensure that these acceptance criteria are met? This doesn't usually involve ID input. Sometimes it does, depending on the feature. But typically this is actual test cases being run. So I put an example in here just to give you an idea of a before and after, because I think this is really telling. So I'm just going to read through this. It's probably not going to make a lot of sense, especially if you don't know anything about Unix. I don't think it makes sense, and I do know something about Unix. So the initial problem statement was, when the user attempts to uninstall and reinstall the Unix managed agent without removing Unix managed agent from the app manager, it's actually revoking the ad hoc maintenance mode flag if already set for the Unix managed agent from the console. So I hear laughter. This is how Unix developers talk. So obviously, this is just kind of like, what? It's not even, it's all one sentence, and it should be more sentences. It doesn't make sense. It's talking about this weird maintenance mode flag. Okay, what user, even Unix user, cares about this maintenance mode flag, right? So they have, their acceptance criteria is that this maintenance mode flag for the agent can be reset either by the user from the console, or you can cold start the Unix agent and to reset that flag. Okay, so what ID immediately said was, do customers even know what this ad hoc flag is? Is this something that they actually see, or is it something that's being set behind the scenes for them to enable them to do something else? And then they also noted that the acceptance criteria seems to describe the workaround. What is the user expecting the product to do after the fix versus a workaround? So after some discussion and some rework, the new problem statement is, if a Unix computer is in maintenance mode and the user manually uninstalls and reinstalls the agent on that computer but does not delete the agent from the console, when the reinstalled agent comes back online, App Manager automatically removes it from maintenance mode. Okay, so that's still kind of a run-on sentence, but you'll see that there's no mention of a maintenance mode flag or an ad hoc maintenance mode flag. All the user cares about is that it was automatically removed from maintenance. So they took out that back-end stuff and said, okay, look, here's what the user is seeing. Here's what the user is expecting. And then the acceptance criteria is, if all of this stuff happens and they don't delete it from the console, then when it comes back online, App Manager should not automatically remove it from maintenance mode. And then another bonus of this stuff is we can actually write release notes directly from the information that we're putting in these user stories. So we basically have, with our problem statement and acceptance criteria here, the writer can then go, oh, look, all the information's right here. It's in user-facing, I don't want to say jargon, user-facing wording. So they can just pull that right then and save themselves having to wade through design documents or bugs or whatever later and then have to translate it into normal speak. So when we first brought up this idea, we got a lot of pushback from the project team because they're like, oh my goodness, it's going to take forever. We don't have time for that. But what they didn't realize was in not doing that and proceeding with the way we had it before, we were spending a ton of time going back and forth trying to figure out what the user impact was. QE would test the wrong thing because they didn't understand what the real issue was. Nobody understood how the feature should really work. ID was having to spend more time figuring out stuff so they could write release notes. So all that time we spent going back and forth because things weren't clear, it ended up paying to actually spend the time up front to start defining these. And what we did, or what we noticed with the teams that were doing this moving forward, yes, initially, the first sprint or two that they did this, it took forever. And everybody was like, oh, this is so painful. But as they got it, they started thinking differently. They started coding differently because they were actually thinking of how a user would see it. And going forward from that point, things were much better. So yes, it's a more, it's short term, it's a big investment. Long term, it paid off in huge ways. So because of the time they invested, for each user story, everybody knew what problem they were fixing, why they were fixing it, what the behavior is once they fix it, and how they'll determine whether they fix it. So the user stories then clearly define the scope of the release. So somebody coming in from outside, like an executive manager or a different product manager that has a dependency, can automatically tell what the team was building very easily without having to do a whole lot of research that we don't have time for. A predefined acceptance test would eliminate unnecessary ad hoc testing. That ad hoc testing is when somebody's just going in there banging on it trying to break it, basically. So we had a more structured and methodical way of testing our product. The documentation took less time because we did some of it up front in these user stories, and everybody understood that they were from a user point of view, so we could, as I mentioned, we could steal it and basically and put it in our release notes and sometimes even in our books. They can expose possibilities for usability testing, which is really good because sometimes if you couldn't quite figure out what was going on, we're always looking for things that we can usability test when we have the time, which lately has been more and more, which has been nice because we get such great feedback and can make good changes to our products based on the results of those tests. And then they also bring to light issues that are not really issues or solutions that don't provide the fix that the user really needs. So I love this one. If you cannot describe how the issue impacts the user, it's probably not worth spending the time to fix. We have had situations where there's been so much discussion, nobody can really tell why this thing is in here. Why are we bothering to spend time trying to fix this? Because nobody can figure out how it affects the user, if it impacts the user negatively. So we've made conscious decisions to leave something unless a user came back and said, we can't do this or this isn't working for us. And that saves time that you can then put on higher priority features or bugs. And then if you can't articulate the acceptance criteria in a way that shows the user the problem is fixed, you probably haven't identified the root cause of the issue. This is very important because you don't want to go in there and fix something based on a wrong assumption. And I say fix in air quotes because sometimes you think you might be fixing something, but you might be making it worse if you are basing it on the wrong assumptions about what the cause is. And then the best part of these is that they force everybody to think about the user impact. Developers cannot dodge thinking about the user if they are forced to write problem statements that are coming from a user standpoint, because that's the whole point of our software. If we aren't helping our users do their jobs with it, why are we here? So everybody that works on that software needs to think in that way. So it also gives development the opportunity to understand the complete end-to-end solution of what is expected. QE understands and tests from a user perspective versus testing a database piece and testing the middle tier piece and testing the UI piece separately. There's no point in that because that's not how a customer uses it. They need to test them all together, put them all together in the build and then test it the way a user would there. It ensures that ID understands the feature in a way that they can write documentation that's targeted to the user's needs in this area versus just documenting the UI or saying, hey, we have this cool new feature. Well, this cool new feature does the user no good if the user doesn't understand how that feature helps them do their job. And finally, it ensures that the product owner is comfortable with the team's understanding of the requirements. So getting this documentation up front helps him or her correct the team if they're not going down the right path, versus having to wait till the end of the sprint when he's shown a demo and they've implemented it completely not in the way that the requirement was written. Okay, so another part of the release plan that I talked about, the big part, is the backlog grooming. So everybody should be working from a backlog when they're doing their planning. Product backlog, and then you pull that into your release backlog, and then you pull things from that into your sprint backlog. So the way that we do backlog grooming and backlog estimating, or user story estimating, I should say, is planning poker. So what this is, if you haven't heard about it, it's a way of using story points to estimate the effort for a particular user story to be done. And when you're estimating that effort, the entire Scrum team should be participating. And, well, I say participating. The entire Scrum team should be in the room. And the people participating and actually voting on the estimate should be the people that, the people producing the product. So the coders, the testers, the writers. When you're putting forward an estimate, it is not just for your part. So usually with planning poker, you use cards that have different numbers on them, and it's meant to be a relative effort. So it's not the number of hours you think it'll take, the number of days you think it'll take. You basically start with one feature or one piece of a feature and say, okay, this is a 2, just for points or for reference for other things that you're estimating. So if you know that this basically baseline one is a 2, this baseline item is a 2, then you can kind of estimate your other things based off of that. So when you're estimating, you have to ensure that you're holding up a card that you think represents the estimate or the total effort involved from all functional areas. That means coding, testing, and documenting. If you're an info dev, don't just hold up a card implying your estimate, because that's not the whole team approach. That's your functional area approach. So you want to be thinking of how long you think it's going to take the whole thing to be done, because that's how you're going to figure out when you're doing, or how which items you're doing by a certain timeline if you have a date restriction there. So user stories that you're going to work on in the near future, the next few sprints that is, need to be small enough that they can be completed in a single sprint. Another problem that I see a lot on Agile teams is user stories are not broken down enough that they can be completed in a single sprint. They're almost like epics or themes, and people just carry them from sprint to sprint, which again defeats the whole purpose of Agile. Having something potentially shippable at the end of a sprint is impossible if you never have anything end at the end of a sprint. You know, if you just carry something on for 3 or 4 or 5 sprints, clearly that user story is not small enough. And then the product owner is there to clarify things. So if everybody in the room holds up a 2 and then somebody holds up a 21, I'm thinking the person that held up the 21 doesn't clearly understand what's needed. So there needs to be some discussion there and say, you know, John, why did you hold up a 21? And he's like, well, I thought it involved this, this, and this, and then it turns out he misunderstood what the requirement was. So that's why the product owner is there to help clarify. Now, it could be that John holding up the 21 is right and everybody else was wrong. Either way that it goes, it's really good to have that discussion and make sure that everybody's on the same page. Otherwise, it becomes apparent very quickly that the requirement is not clear. If you have everybody in the room holding up a different card, perhaps the product owner didn't word that requirement very clearly. So it's good to get that all out on the table so that everybody knows what you're building going forward. And backlog grooming should be done pretty frequently. I have teams that do it once a week. I have teams that do it once a sprint, which is every 3 to 4 weeks. It really depends on the team, the size of the project, how good they are at it, if they keep it up. But it just needs to be done regularly. Once a release cycle is not enough because then you can't accommodate any changes that come in. And part of the backlog grooming is prioritization as well. So you should be constantly reprioritizing. If you have something that's going to be a huge effort and not very much value for the customer, that's probably going to be a lower priority than something that's a very small effort but a huge bang for the buck for the customer. So that comes into play too. So sprint planning. This is where the meat of the matter is. This is where the work gets done in the sprints. So as I mentioned, you pull items from your backlog into your sprint backlog. Now, when you're doing your planning for sprints, you actually use hours. When you're doing it for a release, you do story points. So you're actually using hours here because ultimately this all feeds into your velocity at the end of the sprint, which I mentioned before. So when you're doing your sprint backlogs, you have to make sure that you include time for overhead. A lot of people forget this and think you're going to be coding 8 hours a day, 7 days, or 5 days, not 7 days a week, 5 days a week, and that doesn't happen. You have meetings, you have, well, in here I put info desk specific ones, creating book structures, help conversion, setting up virtual machines, all that stuff that helps you do your job, but is not necessarily writing documentation or making a video or whatever you do to deliver content. You have to make sure that you allow time for it, or your estimates are going to be off and you're going to miss your sprint. So you have to also ensure that your hours fit into your capacity for that project, that sprint, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So your capacity is the number of hours you have available for working on tasks for that sprint. Now, if you're working on multiple projects, say you're 50% on one project and 50% on another project, you've got to remember to cut your hours, your normal work hours in half. Otherwise, you're going to miss a sprint, because if you're trying to give yourself 100% to one project and 100% to another project, you're not going to make that, obviously. You've got to consider your previous sprint estimates and how well you actually accomplished them. If you only accomplished 50 hours worth of work in the previous sprint and you sign yourself up for 80 hours of work in the next sprint, I'm thinking that's probably not going to happen. If you did 3 sprints in a row where you did 50 and then you sign yourself up for 80, that's even less likely to happen. Maybe you just had that first 50 sprint was off, but if that's pretty consistent, your consistent cadence, don't sign yourself up for almost double that. Make sure you take that into account. So some other things to consider are vacation. Obviously, you want to actually take your vacation, not be trying to work on tasks during your vacation days. Planning meetings, customer support, backlog grooming, demos, and retrospectives. So all of that stuff is part of your job that takes part of your time, that takes you away from doing task work, which is fine because it's part of your job and it's support stuff, but you need to remember that. So what we typically do is we estimate 20 to 25% of each of our team members' time for these items. So what that means is if you are on 2 projects, split 50-50, we have 20% time overhead that we don't even put into project work, and that gives them 40% to each project rather than 50%, and they do their hours from there. So when you're figuring out your capacity, do not include the first or last day of the sprint. And the reason we say that is because typically the last day of a sprint is demo day. Your team will be having your sprint demos and retrospectives on that day. So there's no point in planning task time for that, because hopefully your tasks are done in time for the demo. And if you're on 2 projects, then if you're busy with demo day for project A, you're not going to have time for work on project B. And then I mentioned this before too, and make sure that development finishes early so that you can get your task complete before the sprint ends. If that doesn't happen, what's going to end up happening there is you're going to miss user stories, you're going to miss sprints. Sometimes you miss 6 or 7 sprints in a row, and it's not your fault, and it's incredibly frustrating because dev is just not finishing in time. But ultimately, we have found that after they get questioned a few times by upper management, missing dates or whatever, and there's some honest, open dialogue in our retrospectives, typically the developers try a little harder to get things done. Now, it might be that they have to put in fewer user stories in that next sprint because they know that they can't code that much and still leave some time for the other areas to be done and for the whole team to consider things done. So this is a worksheet that we use here. As I mentioned, we have all of our writers are on at least 2 projects. I have some writers on 3. And it would be lovely to have everybody on one project because the context switching alone, if I'm sure all of you have worked on multiple projects at a time, it's difficult to deal with at times. But we don't have that. So what we've done is we have this spreadsheet that people use a lot of times to figure out what's going on with them over the upcoming weeks. And often if you have 2 different projects, they're not on the same schedule, which is good. You typically don't want them on the same schedule because if you're trying to finish up 2 sprints for 2 projects, it's very difficult. The only problem with having them on different schedules is that it's kind of harder to keep up with what's going on with which one when. which is why we have this spreadsheet. So what this spreadsheet does is allow you to actually put down what your capacity is for each day for each project. So if you'll notice here in my example, Meredith is a team member for Project A and Project B, so she's working on both of them. She's got different dates for these two sprints. She's got sprint 1 for this project and sprint 3 for this project, and they're not the exact same days. They overlap by a couple days. So if you'll see that Project B has a planning day on February 15th. That's up on the Project B on February. So you'll see a P on the Project B part of the spreadsheet. That means planning. And if you look up on her Project A spreadsheet for February 15th, you'll notice that she has a red 0 there. And the reason she did that is because she knows that that planning day for Project B is going to take all day, which means she's not going to have any time to work on Project A that day. If she had put something besides a 0 there, she's going to miss it because she doesn't have time to do it. So her capacity for that day is 0 on Project A. Whereas if you look at the day before, February 14th, on Project A, she's got 3 hours there, and on Project B, she's got 3 hours there. So she's split 50-50, and the way she's dividing her work right now is working 3 hours on each day. Now, you don't have to do that. You could work, on one project for a whole day, and then on the other project for the whole day the next day, however you want to do that. But it's important to know what your capacity is, because when you're estimating things and trying to tell people on your team when you can have something ready, if it's going to take you 6 hours to do something and you only have 3 hours between now and when they want it, you can tell them, I can't do that. It's going to take me too much time, and here's what my capacity is. This has been extremely helpful to us when we have had to push back on either product managers or development managers that want something when they want it and we can't deliver it, because they like to see numbers. We just pull out the spreadsheet and go, look, here's what's going on. And they go, oh, whereas before we had the spreadsheet, we just said, well, I can't do that because I got this going on. I mean, they don't care about the other project you're working on. They want their project done. But when you show them numbers, it really makes a bigger impact, and it's helped us quite a bit. It helped them understand what we're really doing.
So, Alyssa, I have a question. This is Sarah. You do that estimating process or the time allocation capacity before the estimation meeting, so that your people know how much they can commit to for the sprint?
Yes, that's correct. So we typically do it. I mean, it's all really within a day or two of each other, but we do it right around the same time. So you can go into the sprint planning meeting saying, okay, here's how much time I have. I know that I have 50 hours this sprint for this project. And you know that because you did your capacity planning sheet.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so just a few more tips about how to cope with multiple projects and meetings. Often if you're working on multiple projects, Agile has a lot of meetings. And some people complain about that. I personally think it's good, because instead of sending emails around and tracking things through bug trackers and doing all this documentation, you're communicating with each other on a regular basis. The downside of that is if you're on multiple projects and trying to cope with going to all the meetings for one project, going to all the meetings for another project, and doing work for both projects, it can become a little overwhelming. So sometimes you might not be going to all the stand-up meetings. Sometimes if you have multiple writers on a project, you can send the other writer to the stand-up meeting. Sometimes there are times when you have a release going out next week, so that's your highest priority right then. Maybe you only go to that project's meetings that week and get summaries for your other projects meetings. A lot of times we have people, the Scrum Master will send out email summaries for the stand-up meetings for those that couldn't make it. We actually have a couple teams that do their stand-ups online using a tool called Campfire. It's basically like an IM window. They do it all in there, then they capture it all and save it, and then people that didn't make the meeting can read it later. A big part of this is making sure that you have a presence on your team so your team doesn't forget you when you're not there. I talk a lot about gaining clout on your team and becoming an equal member of the team. You have to be a little aggressive, especially if you're on a new team or on a team that doesn't understand or value what information development really is, or technical communicators what they can do. You have to constantly show your value and show why it's important you're there, and be a little pushy and show up at meetings that you don't necessarily get invited to. So your team remembers you and knows that they need to bring something up with you, because there will be times that you have to attend another meeting or something, and if you've made that presence known, then after that first meeting that you missed, they'll go, oh, we need to tell so-and-so about this because this is probably going to affect the doc, versus, you know, you finding out about it 3 days later accidentally, and if you hadn't stumbled across it in the build, you never would have known, kind of thing. And then sometimes what you can do is determine when the best time for team kickoffs are and get involved then. We have a couple teams that do a lot of research for different things that they're trying to figure out whether we should put in the product or not. And for a while there, they were inviting us to all these meetings, and we were just too busy to go. And they wanted to sit around and discuss, you know, design and stuff, which is good. But often we don't need to be involved in all of that. So what we did was we put together a list of criteria that basically said, when you've done this, when you've researched this, when you're ready for this, and we had, I don't know, 5 or 6 things on it, I think, this is when to get InfoDev involved. And then they would have a kickoff meeting, invite InfoDev and QE and everybody, and say, okay, we're kicking this off, we're ready to start coding, here's where we are. So we found that to be really helpful too when we're overwhelmed with too many projects going on. So just a quick note on sizing InfoDev work. If you have, a lot of places have their own ways of estimating what something takes or how long something takes. We have standard estimates that we use. It used to be per page or documentation because everything we did was books. Now more and more people are going online, so it's a little harder to estimate that way. We're starting to do videos, technical content videos as well, so we're going to have to start coming up with a way of how do we estimate that, because if we put that in our plans, we need to know how long it's going to take us to do it. But if you have a typical estimate that you use across the team based on experience, that's really helpful in trying to get something a little more accurate. So if you plug in your tasks based on the information in the user story, you can use those estimates to quickly estimate the amount of work needed to complete your tasks. And then you need to ensure that you compare the number of hours required to complete tasks to total hours of your capacity. So for example, if your team, you should be participating in the sprint planning with your team. If your team wants to pull in, you know, features 1, 2, 3, and 4, and when you figure out what you need to do for features 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it's beyond your capacity, then you need to make sure that you speak up and say, guys, we're not going to be able to complete this in the sprint, because according to the whole team philosophy, the user story is not complete until coding, testing, and doc is done. If those all cannot be done, y'all are going to miss the sprint if you try to commit the team to that. So that's why it's very important that all functional areas be involved in that sprint planning so that you guys can speak up and say, hey, according to my estimates, we're not going to make this. Now, there might be times that you feel like you can squeeze a little bit and probably make it. I mean, use your gut a little bit too. It's not all going to be based purely on numbers. Use your experience. But if it's way off, like 15 hours off, that's probably not going to happen. So it's good to be realistic. Otherwise, because the team just gets dejected if you miss the sprint. So you want to make sure that you do your part in speaking up and say, I'm concerned about this. And then you need to ensure that you include tasks for things that are not necessarily just writing text documentation. Usability tests, this is all stuff that my team does. I'm sure that some other writing teams do these as well. UI review, usability testing, I mentioned the videos that we're starting to do. Any kind of improvements or bugs, doc bugs that you need to fix. People tend to kind of forget those because they're like all about the new stuff. But you don't want your technical debt in documentation to add up any more than you want your technical debt in the product, because then people start getting frustrated with the doc. They can't find what they need. Things aren't being fixed and improved. So this is just an example sheet from the spreadsheet that we use. It's actually in Excel, and we have formulas built in. So if you put in, like you'll see on the first line, the help-only topic of one topic converts to 2 hours of total time, because that's the estimate that we use is 2 hours per help topic. If you're writing a completely new page of doc with very little source material or very weak source material, we estimate that at 6 hours a page. And a lot of that is because we do a lot of trying to explain why they want to do something. We don't just slap a procedure on a page, because in the past, the complaints we've heard from our customers are that, you know, you have all this information about how to do things, but you don't ever tell me when to do it or why I would do it. So they don't understand when they should do that. So information like that, conceptual information and workflows and scenarios and all that, takes a lot more time to write than just a procedure. So that's why we have that 6 hours there. But I just threw this in here to show you guys kind of an example of using those standard, consistent estimates will really help in getting you more accurate as you go on. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about potentially shippable, because I think this throws technical communicators for a loop all the time. Not just technical communicators, but testers and developers as well. But the reason I want to talk about it with us is because a lot of times people say, well, we can't ship at the end of a sprint. I have to run a help conversion, and I have to print this book, and I have to, run the PDF, and I have to do all this stuff that I can't do, and so we can't ship. So I want to make the point that potentially shippable means that for only the part of the product that was developed in that sprint. So the documentation for those user stories is complete and shippable. If you had to, you could run a PDF of 2 pages of doc and ship that, quote unquote, as beta doc, for example. You don't have to have your entire documentation library ready to go at the end of every sprint. If you wanted to, if your product owner said, hey, this feature looks fantastic, let's ship it in a, not the full product, but in a small package, then there should be no reason that documentation for that particular feature is not ready and ready to go. So I think people get all wrapped around an axle about there's no way a writer can ever be ready to ship something at the end of a sprint, and that's not the case. So other things to consider are that the UI review for those user stories is complete and all the changes are implemented. The entire book and help system are probably not complete and shippable until some ID-only user stories are complete in the last sprint or after sprint. So that's important to remember. A lot of times, sometimes you might have to have some hardening, which is typically finishing up testing, finishing up doc, if you're about to put out a full big product release. So any kind of concept, procedure, and reference necessary for that user story are done. And then what the acceptance test would be for the documentation there is that review by the team, that you're getting done those little snippets of docs that I talked about earlier. The SMEs are reviewing those. You've implemented the changes. They're ready to go at the end of the sprint. That's why you have to have your documentation review in the sprint and not delay that to the next sprint either. And then other doc tasks are probably not done. For example, a help conversion or an entire set of release notes written. Remember, it's snippets. Each sprint produces snippets, whether it's a feature or a snippet of doc or a snippet of code. It's not the entire product. So we have what I call ID-driven user stories and tasks and ID-only user stories and tasks. And the ID-driven ones happen during sprints. So these are things such as any kind of doc improvement. We have actually an initiative here at NetIQ called Targeted Documentation that we've been going through for the last couple of years. We're streamlining and reworking a lot of our doc to follow this model. So it's improvement user stories and tasks that often require some sort of review from an SME because of the way we reorganize things or the way that we rewrite things to add conceptual information or workflow or scenario information. Usability testing. That should be happening during the sprint because that usability testing is related to a user story. So that is part of that user story. It needs to be done in that sprint. Bugs or new user stories entered to accommodate the results. That doesn't mean you're necessarily going to fix everything that you saw as a result of that test in that sprint, but that you've tracked it, you've recorded it, and then can later, as you groom the backlog, figure out when you want to do that. And then UI review tasks are directly related to some features and user stories. They need to be done within that sprint. ID-only user stories and tasks are things that don't necessarily fit into a user story with dev and QE tasks. For example, sending out the, compiling and sending out the approval draft, then incorporating comments for that. A final review by an ID lead if you need that. That's what our quality edit draft that I referred to previously, that's what that is. Any kind of production work that you're doing, help conversion I mentioned. Finalizing a video, stuff like that. Anything that's only ID related, it's infrastructure and overhead work. That kind of stuff typically happen late in the game, you know, when you're wrapping things up for the release, just like in a waterfall method. There are certain things that we do that is simply preparing for production or preparing for shipping. And then finalizing release notes. That's always the last thing we do, typically right up into the very last day before we ship, because things are, you know, after you're doing that 5-day burn test or whatever you're doing at the very end to make sure that your gold master is ready to go. That's not necessarily going to be in a sprint. We have teams here that don't do sprints, don't track sprints anymore once code is complete, because it's just testing. We have teams that do track that in sprints, and it's just tracked as testing stories. So it gets a little weird towards the end of a release, depending on how your establishment does that. But these are some things that we would be doing towards the end of a release that are ID only. Okay, and this is just a list of my references that I've used, just so to give these people proper credit for the things that I've learned and incorporated and included in this discussion. So that is all that I have to present. Are there any questions?
I have another question.
Okay.
Do you have templates that you use for your stories other than the user story? Like to make sure that, like for an epic, that all of the doc and UX and everyone's been considered and everything is within that story? Do you have any templates like that?
Do you mean for the documentation of the user story itself?
Not that. I guess I'm asking if to define the unit of work, is all that you have a user story, or do you have other criteria? I guess is what I'm asking.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. No, we only use the user story, and we put the acceptance criteria in the user story.
Okay.
And then, I mean, we have test cases and stuff, of course, that's kept in another area. But, yeah, I mean, what we're trying to get to is what I showed you here, you know, having the acceptance test, or typically what we do is we have the problem statement and the description and the acceptance criteria documented within our Agile tracking tool. We use version 1 for that user story, and then we have links out to our tool that holds our acceptance test, all of our test cases. So links for that user story go over to our tool, and I want to say test director, I'm not sure if that's right, that they have the test cases in there for that.
Okay.
Is that does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Anybody else? Nope.
Oh, wow. Well done. Yeah. Everybody's just digesting everything with so much information. It's great.
Yeah, well, I hope it was helpful. I know it is a lot of information, but I really feel like the whole team approach is the backbone for making this successful, and I wanted to make sure that I covered the ID parts of that so that everybody would understand, you know, why it's important that we follow that. So if you think of any questions later, my contact information is on the deck. I think, Sarah, are y'all going to make the deck available on your website or something, or point to SlideShare? Okay. So feel free to email me or call me. I'm always happy to talk about this. I enjoy talking about it and helping people with it because it is an interesting and fun challenge to solve.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alyssa. This is great.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks so much for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
All right. Y'all have a good night.